Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday to you all, and it's exciting. I'm delighted that you've decided to take the time to join us for daily devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. And if you haven't met me yet, I'm Dan. I'm a teaching pastor here, and we're going to continue this long, arduous journey through the New Testament over the course of an entire year. And now we're getting close to mid-November, and we're near the end of this wonderful, profound, glorious book called Hebrews. And today, we're going to be finishing up the second half of chapter 11, historically and famously known as the Hall of Faith. It's filled with characters and examples about people who are commended for not just having great faith, but having great faith as expressed in their confidence in God and his promises. In other words, these people lived how they lived. They did the things that they did. They said the things that they said. They bore persecutions in the way that they did. They were steadfast in the work that God called them to do because of their trustworthiness, in God, who is faithful. And so everything that you're going to read here, as we read yesterday and even in today, are just filled with living examples, living illustrations of the definition of faith, which, as we remember from yesterday, is that faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the certainty of things not yet seen, which is really interesting because I think all of us have heard the saying that seeing is believing, and that once you see something, then that you believe it. I don't know if the author of Hebrews would agree with that, where he knows, like you and I know, that our vision and our knowledge is always limited. My sight, the things that I can see and perceive, are always limited spatially. I can't see everything. My sight is also limited temporally because I can't see into the future. And my knowledge, as small as my brain is, could not possibly know everything, so that the decisions that I make with regards to the future, with regards to the things that I don't know, but the things that I'm hopeful for, I am always, the course of action that I take is always going to be based upon the person whom I trust. Whether if your trust happens to be in some financial investor, or your trust might be in a family member who you really respect. It could be your trust is in a boyfriend or a girlfriend who you've had a fling with, and just say, oh, it doesn't matter, throw all caution to the wind and just follow your heart, kind of thing. I think we've all been in that position once, time or another, and maybe gotten a tattoo that we wish we didn't have gotten because we put our trust in somebody who, frankly, was not actually that trustworthy. And here's, I guess, the reason why it is that a book like this, or a chapter like this, is so important. Well, for one, that living a godly life, that is a life that's modeled after the very heart of God, always begins with trusting in him. In other words, I have to grow in my trust with God if I'm ever going to be a person who emulates his character. And the good thing, as I've also been learning, even as a new parent, is that as I'm trying to raise my son, is that even at this very young age, I'm practicing how to cultivate trust, so that even if trust is very small, it's the sort of thing that if it's nurtured, it's going to grow, so that over time, as my son was going to learn how to trust me, I'm also going to learn how to put trust in God. And that also, that trust is the sort of thing that it has to grow through challenges, where I had heard it put this way before, where faith is always spelled the same way in the Bible everywhere. It's spelled R-I-S-K. There's always some kind of risk, always some kind of challenge that's involved, so that it's designed or intended for us to be able to grow in our faith. That if there was never any kind of risk or any kind of danger or any kind of challenge, our faith would never grow because we'd never actually learn to trust God. And it also reminds me of a certain story a pastor, a friend of mine, had said long and long ago when his church was facing very dire financial circumstances. And this was a time where he left his office and there was nobody else apparently in the church, and just went straight to the altar and laid this predicament before him, and prayed for provision. And it was in that moment that the Lord convicted him and said, you would really, really like to be in a position where you didn't have to trust me. And that changed him in his pastoral work, and changed him indeed as a person, because he realized that to walk in a way where we never really actually had to learn how to trust God, that means that we can essentially live our lives independent from him. And the beautiful thing about something like this is that the way that these people live lives that are characteristic of that have this living trust in a living God, that these were also the same people who tasted living intimacy with God in ways that maybe people like you or I could even only hope to imagine. And yet, looking at a passage like this, it is still a call upon us to grow and to feed our faith in such a way so that it bears the kind of quality that these men and women shared, and who our lives are we're the beneficiaries of the sort of faith that they invested in God, that has achieved or has reached us through compound interest, and we're the beneficiaries of it. And the last thing I want us to point out is, well, for one, that aside from the way in which each of these historic figures exercised profound faith, even in the face of danger and risk, that the outcomes of each of their lives still actually varies to some degree. So in other words, the nature of the trust that we're putting in God is not this one that is more like a vending machine, or that there's a mechanical way about it, that if you're investing your type of trust into this person or this thing, that you can always expect the same results. It reminds me a little bit of, say, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were faced capital punishment by being burned alive in a furnace, and then made their defense before King Nebuchadnezzar and said, look, we know our confidence in God and his ability to be able to save us from your hand is unquestioned. Just because we're slaves in a foreign land and you're threatening our lives by throwing us into a furnace, that doesn't change God. We know what he's capable of doing, and our full trust is in him. And then he follows it up and says, but if not, suppose God doesn't rescue us. That's not going to change the faith that we're going to put in him, because our faithfulness to God and our trust that we're putting in him is of utmost importance. There's nothing more important. Even at the cost of our very lives, we're still going to follow him. And there's nothing that you can do that's going to force us to compromise our putting faith in a God who loves us. And that, I would say, is the common denominator between all of these heroes of the faith, that even while the outcomes of their lives, which, by the by, does not follow in any real consistent fashion the way in which that you and I typically measure success in people's lives, whether that's financial, material, the people who live these lives of great faith, the outcomes of their lives as we see them are actually quite different, and yet they are all still very much the same. That there was nothing more important to them than a living faith in the living God, and that determined their actions and the course, the trajectory of their lives, and has made a lasting difference. In short, you might say, they wanted their lives to count. And if you want your life to count, there's no better investment than in the word and the trustworthiness of a God who is trustworthy. And for that, their lives continue to make a difference because of a living faith that they put in God. So, with this in mind, let's read through Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to begin in verse 22 and finish up with verse 40. So I'm going to get a sip of coffee, and we're going to keep going. And so we just finished up yesterday, but with Jacob, as he was dying, he blessed each of Joseph's sons as he worshiped, as he leaned on the top of his staff. So now we're going to just shift from Jacob to Joseph. The same Joseph of the coat of many colors, or the Technicolor Dreamcoat, depending on what version you're following. This is the guy they're referring to. But let's continue. It says, by faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. Pausing there, giving instructions about his bones. It's important to remember that Joseph is an official, like a government official in Egypt, so that when he was going to die, it would be fully expected that he would actually be buried in Egypt, where he was serving as part of governmental official royalty. But he says, no, make sure that when I die and all of my children, eventually when they all leave Egypt, when they're liberated from their slavery, something that he's, he hasn't foreseen yet. It says, one day you're going to inhabit the land of Canaan, and you're going to settle there, and make sure that my bones are resting in the place that my people call home, which was a promise that God had given, that he himself, as he was dying, is something that he would never live to see, but says, no, make sure you take my bones with you, because I have faith that the God who promised this to my forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, my father, that God's going to do it. And when that happens, make sure that you take my bones with you, so that even as I'm dead, I still have participation in the promise that God had made for my fathers and for my children. I want to be a part of that story. And that's the whole business about instructions about Joseph's bones. But let's continue. It says, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, and Barak, and Samson, and Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured, and refused to be released, so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and in holes in the ground. Profound, isn't it? How the author of Hebrews sees these living people, these living examples of faith that in the eyes of the world has put them at the very bottom. And how this is God's way of demonstrating how he says that there's these people at the bottom and the rest of the world all at the top. And it's the rest of the world that is unworthy of the bottom. That he has taken the world and its values and turned it all upside down. This is just the sort of theology that we remember in studying 1 Corinthians chapters 1 through 4. That this is what God has done to humble the hearts of rebellious, sinful people by taking all of the things that the world despises, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. This is what God has done, and this is the example that he's left for us to follow. So, let's continue. It says, verse 39, these were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. In short, the fulfillment of promises, as we've been reading through Hebrews up until this point, he finds it fulfilled in the thing that they've seen happen before their very eyes, materialized in human history. God's hand of deliverance and rescue and fulfillment has come to fruition in Jesus Christ, who is immeasurably supreme over angels and Moses and the temple and the sacrifices and Melchizedek. He's immeasurably superior to all of them. And none of these people who put their faith in the living God actually saw what happened. And that didn't stop them from their wholehearted trust and obedience in God. And it says this, verse 40, God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. In other words, whenever we grow or exercise or reflect the same faith that we did, it's like our stories are getting intertwined, because your story and my story, they become a part of God's story. They become a part of what he's doing. And so in the same way that if we invest our lives and our faith and trust in God in the same way that they did, we're becoming a part of God's grand story, his grand design in bringing about his purposes for creation. And he's decided to make you and me a part of it. How profound, how humbling something like that is. That God in his work of sheer grace and mercy to bring about renewal and redemption and hope for a lost world has made us a part of it and invites us every single day. And to do that, it has to come by way of faith. And so it's my prayer for each and every one of us that whatever measure of faith that we have, that it's the sort of faith that grows, the sort of faith that we nurture, and the sort of faith that produces the fruit of righteousness that actually lasts and that makes a difference, not just in the matter of our lives and the lives of those around us, our contemporaries and our peers, but for generations to come. Because this is the substance of lasting legacies, everlasting legacies. So thank you so much for joining us for Daily Devotions. And if you haven't, I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel or even check out our podcasts, and also consider investing, offering, supporting us financially through this church planting work here in Columbia City. And come what may, I do pray that God would bless you, that when you have the opportunity to be a part of the work that we're doing here, and may each of us continue to grow in the wisdom and the knowledge of the Lord as we are growing mature disciples and devoting our lives, living faith to the work that God has called us to do, to be the people that God has called us to be. So thank you so much. Take care, and I'll see you next time.